Greetings, my companion. We are live. And yeah, let me just, I need to take the bottle cap off of here. Otherwise, I'll never be able to do it one handed. So, greetings, everyone. We are live here on YouTube. And I thought we would have some fun today with a stream. I want to update you guys, and I also want to, maybe do some readings, maybe answer some questions. We'll see, how it goes, basically. But to update you guys on the fundraising and where we're at with the PC and everything. I specifically wanted to maybe spend a little bit of time tonight reading a certain section of Morgoth's Ring and talking about sort of the, the foolishness of worrying about what is and what is not canon in Tolkien's work. Hey there, Walter, how's it going? Which is a trap that I think anybody who studies Tolkien gets into this trap. And, I myself got into that trap a while back and clawed my way out of it, much like Gandalf falling into the pit at the bridge of Khazad-dûm, and then, having this, not only this triumphant climb upwards to the tallest peak of the Misty Mountains, but also returning from death, which is a big deal. Doesn't happen a lot in Tolkien's Legendarium. Yes, that's actually reading a little bit more on the whole concept of classics in the matter of Britain was really what opened my eyes towards it. Also, a little bit of there was a lot of controversies. Hello, I hope I'm saying your name right. Nashinus? If I say your name wrong, if I ever say anybody's name wrong, I want you to let me know. I appreciate being told how to pronounce people's names because I like to get it right. I have a very easy to pronounce name. Nobody gets John wrong, It'd be weird if they did. I had this one teacher, actually. Oh, man, he was... oh, boy, let me tell you about this guy there. Hey there, Ashlyn. How's it going? And Ethan? Welcome in, everybody. I'm going to be talking about the fundraising and everything. You love my glasses? I'm rather fond of them myself. I definitely need a new prescription. But, boy, I would love to keep the same frames or get similar ones because I think they're really good. I'm going to update you guys and everything. We're going to talk about Morgoth's Ring. We're going to answer any questions coming from the chat today. But... there was a lot of controversy about the TV show, The Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power, which is sort of loosely based off of Tolkien's story, The Rings of Power, which became, in its publication, it became of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, which is the very last chapter of the Silmarillion. But they couldn't use that. They couldn't use that. There was some legal issues with that. They can't pull from that. They have to pull only from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and anything contained therein. It's the only rights they have. So, people would say, well, they point to things on the show and they'd say, well, it's not canon. And it was actually Professor Corey Olson, whom I've talked to. He's a huge inspiration for my channel. For taking what I know and what I study and bringing it to the masses. Because I was just doing it just for my own sort of amusement, Sort of like Tolkien, he really wrote for his own benefit, for his children, for his friends. Publication came later. He was mostly publishing academic papers, early on. And even then, they were kind of criticized for being too creative, you know. But anyway, Olson, Professor Olson said there really isn't a canon in Tolkien's work because he was always changing his mind, and I mean you see this in as early as the very first thing that he published, his first published fictional work, I should say, which was The Hobbit, where and I'm not even talking about how the first edition was different from the subsequent editions, mainly relating to the characterization of Gollum and how Gollum wasn't so evil in the first draft. But really, just how much of the Hobbit is directly contradicted by the Lord of the Rings. And it was sort of said, well, that was the story the way that Bilbo told it, and is not necessarily uh, fictionalized, but it's a little bit skewed. And, we're meant to understand that Bilbo either left things out or added some things or anything that he needed to do to make sure that it was a good story fit for Hobbit children and not the exact things that he encountered and the exact things that happened to him. Because he wasn't writing a Silmarillion, he was writing a book. He never said, I'm going to finish my memoirs or I'm going to finish writing down my diary. He said, I'm going to finish my book. So we got a story in, well, a few versions of drafts of a story, I should say, in Unfinished Tales called The Quest for Erebor. And in that one, Gandalf quite plainly says that a lot of the things that Bilbo wrote were very creative, and that if he wrote the story, he would have written it very differently. Of course, he wasn't there for everything that happened, but, this is an example of Tolkien sort of changing his mind because initially, even though there were a lot of references to things like Gondolin and the flight of the elves and Elrond's in it, The Hobbit, it wasn't meant to be a story that necessarily took place in Middle Earth, believe it or not. As a matter of fact, you could scan through The Hobbit and nowhere does it say the phrase Middle Earth. It says the wide world. Um, and it never says the Shire either. So, those are concepts that were actually introduced in The Lord of the Rings. So, how is Tom Bombadil a Dutch doll? Well, it's not that Tom Bombadil is specifically a Dutch doll. It's that the Tolkien family had a doll that was a Dutch-made doll, and it belonged to Tolkien's son Michael. And or was it? No, yeah, it belonged to Michael, and his other son John. He thought the doll was creepy looking, and he tried to flush it down the toilet because he thought it was creepy, and that created a huge mess. But anyway, the doll was named. They called it Old Tom. That was what Michael called the doll. He called it Old Tom. So when after the toilet incident happened, Tolkien thought it was very, very funny, and he started writing poems about Old Tom. Some of them are in the book The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. Some of them are actually in The Lord of the Rings. And for a little while, when he was coming up with the ideas for The Lord of the Rings, he briefly considered making Old Tom the main character, but then he decided that it needed to be a story about hobbits, so he ditched that. He didn't actually write anything about old Tom being the lead in the Lord of the Rings. He just considered it. But that's what it is. It's basically that they had this Dutch doll. That it's not that the doll was called Tom. It was that the Tolkien's called it Old Tom. And then if you've ever seen a picture of what it looked like, um, it is sort of creepy. But it has the hat and the coat, so you can kind of see where yeah, they gave it that name. It wasn't a name that was given by the Dutch. It was just that it was a doll that in a style of doll making that is and hey there, Sithis, I'm sorry I didn't greet you there. That is known in the Netherlands, and because you guys are really good at making toys. A lot of great toys came from the Netherlands, and They just called it that. It wasn't that it was a Tom doll from the Netherlands. It was just they had this doll and that Michael Tolkien called it Old Tom. You know, I mean, it's the weirdest thing. Boys, when boys play with dolls, it's so much different from when girls play with dolls. When girls play with dolls, they're usually living out some kind of crazy fantasy. Hey, flower. Um, Whereas when boys have a doll, they're usually sort of making an extension of themselves, and just sort of like a companion rather than a character, And my nephew Nathan, he's 11 years old now, but when he was really young, when he was about 5 or 6 years old, he had this little doll, and that he insisted that the doll was real. It wasn't a doll. He hated if you called it a doll. He said, "It's not a doll, it's a baby, and his name is Charlie." And for a little while, he was obsessed with the name Charlie. Everything was Charlie with him, which was sort of weird for me because my landlord at the time was named Charlie. So I was like, oh, okay, that's a very different sort of character there. But he said that Charlie was an evil baby that kept him. I don't know why he was evil. He just said that. Boys are weird like that when it comes to dolls. You're restoring the realm of Rune. Well, I assume you mean the lands just to the east of Rovanian, which, do you know what Rune means? It just means east. Hey, Tommy does Chile, how's it going? So let me give you guys, now that we've got a little bit of a crowd here, let me give you guys an update, and then I already answered one question. If you guys have any questions, you can just put them right there in the chat, and I'll get to them. But let me give you guys an update. So, if you've seen the GoFundMe recently, we are at $1,066, which there's like a flex goal thing, so the goal keeps going up, right? But really, basically, what I spoke to the person who's going to build the computer for me, and uh, her name is Corin. She lives on the West Coast, and she told me, that she came up with a build for me, basically meaning all the different parts, not including the graphics processing unit, because I have already purchased that, which I'm going to have to send to her. And she said, I came up with a build, and she said the whole cost of everything, with including her fee, because we have to pay her. I don't expect her to do this for free. That would be ridiculous. Her fee and also the cost uh, of shipping everything comes out to about $1,200, just shy of 1,200. And the reality is that this is really good news. You could put it in the YouTube tab, but I won't get to it for a while. You could just put it right there if you want. You know what I mean? Um, no, I know, Walter. I was just messing with you. So if you have a question, you can just put it there. So even though we're at, I think it's 1,060 somewhat dollars in the GoFundMe, the really good news is we've reached the goal because some of you guys donated to PayPal. So including the PayPal stuff in there, we're at the goal. So right now, what I'm waiting for is basically for the money to clear. Um, I checked I mean, I didn't expect to see anything today because it's Sunday, but I checked the app, the GoFundMe app, and everything is in there. I connected it to my bank account and everything. And you want it in a video on YouTube? This is a video on YouTube. This is a video on YouTube. So I'm live on YouTube right now, and this will be available as a video right after this with no members only. Um, no members only restrictions at all. But anyway, if you want to wait, that's fine. But just keep in mind, it'll be a little while. But you can absolutely do that. You could use the community tab. But so basically, I connected it to my bank account, and it said that it's processing, and it doesn't tell me how long it takes to process. But when I Googled it, and I spoke to a friend who was one of my moderators who used GoFundMe not too long ago, it takes like 2 to 5 business days. So once the money is actually in my bank account, I'm going to send 1,200 of it to Corin, and she's going to start building the computer. And she says it won't take long. And then she has to ship it to me. I also have to ship her a few items. One of them is the graphics unit that I bought not long ago, and also my hard drives. I have two. Well, there's one that's a hard drive, and there's another in there that's what they call a solid state drive. And the reason that I want to, could you stop spamming, please, Sam? I don't know what you're doing, but I don't know why you're saying that, but you can say it just once and leave it alone. So I have to send her the hard because all of my writing and music and all the stuff that I collect and everything's on there. So I'm gonna have her put that in the new computer along with obviously a new hard drive. So there's some additional costs. And for anybody who like I said, if you continue to donate, what does it go towards? Well, like I said, there are still going to be shipping costs involved with me sending her things, but also her sending it to me because we don't know how much that's going to be. She calculated the shipping of buying the parts, but not necessarily of sending me the computer. And also, it turns out there's going to be a few more things I'm going to need to get. The main thing is a optical drive because, hey, Time Lord guy, because modern computer cases do not no longer come with the bays where an optical drive could fit. So basically, that's why most PCs don't have optical drives. I need an optical drive for many reasons. There are a lot of things that I have that are on CD or DVD or Blu-ray, including the fact that I wanted to, do analyses of the films and whatnot. So, but but anyway, guys, that's the update that we've pretty much successfully fundraised a new computer. Um, some of the donations were incredibly, just wonderfully generous. If anybody, if you're in the chat and you have donated since the last time that I streamed, just say hi, let me know, and I'll do a reading for you. I know one person that I owe a reading to is Deborah. You would guess the wereworms are a fabrication from Bilbo. Probably not, no. I actually did a deep dive on the idea of it not too long ago. So I have here, they're upside down. Let me flip them around here. Why are these upside down? Okay. I have here, this is the history of Middle-earth here, And it's interesting is that a lot of that is analyses of the early versions of the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. And what's not included is the Hobbit. There are two separate volumes, sometimes sold as just one volume, that is the history of the Hobbit. The first part is called Mr. Baggins, and the second part is called Return to Bag End. And sometimes you can get it as just one book, which is called The History of the Hobbit. And in the very earliest version of The Hobbit that he wrote, first of all, he didn't say wereworms. He said, first of all, it was singular, and he didn't say where, he said wire. He said wire worm. And he specifically mentioned, Bilbo that is, that the wire worm was in China, believe it or not. Because as I said, the Hobbit was not intended to be something that took place in Middle-earth originally. It wasn't until he started writing The Lord of the Rings that he had to sort of retcon some things. That retcon, short for retroactive continuity, where you apply a later idea to an earlier work. Anyway, so he changed it from the wireworms of the wireworm of China, and then later it was the wereworm of the Gobi Desert, which is a desert that is partially in China, partially in Mongolia, and then later on it became the wereworms of the Far East, and which would be the realms beyond Rhûn, which would be the area of Middle-earth that is analogous to China and Mongolia. So then we would say, well, a wireworm is a real thing. And a wireworm is just a bug larva of certain sorts of caterpillars that turn into moths. They're called wireworms. But he changed it to weirworm. And when you use that term weir, it means man. So, and then when you understand that when he uses the term worm, he is not usually referring to the sort of burrowing little creature. Now, they do mention worms, like earthworms, pretty early on. I think it's the very first paragraph of The Hobbit. I'm going to grab it right now. Werewolf, there wolf, their castle. I hope that's what you were referencing. Werewolf, there wolf, their castle. It's one of my favorite comedies. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell. So, right, the first sentence mentions worms. However, in every other instance in the Hobbit, especially every single time that Bilbo himself uses the term worm, he's referring to dragons. And when you think of the idea of a were-worm, worm being an old English word that means essentially serpent, and so you're calling it basically a man serpent, which is the perfect way of describing Tolkien's dragons because they are living, speaking things that may have souls that were transplanted into them via necromancy of Morgoth. So, if you read The Children of Húrin, and you can learn a little bit about the way that Glaurung, who was the very first dragon in Middle Earth, the way that he worked, and then you can understand a lot more about Smaug. So I think that and Bilbo was boasting. He probably didn't know what he was talking about. It's probably he just heard of there being something called wereworms in an eastern land, but he meant what he was meaning was that he meant to say dragons. Peter Jackson chose to interpret the wereworms as actual worms, which was actually a reference to King Kong. King Kong, the original 1930s film, had what we would today refer to as a deleted scene, where a bunch of the characters were walking across a ravine on a log, and then King Kong shows up and shakes the log, and a bunch of them fall down into this pit of spiders and worms, and they're eaten. And then when Peter Jackson made his remake of King Kong, which was about 2004, 2005, somewhere around there, he included that sequence and he had a lot of crazy worms in there. So I think that he just likes monster worms, and that's why he put them in the Hobbit: The Battle of the Five Armies. Hey Omar, how's it going? So basically, yeah. So when he said wereworms, there probably really are dragons in the east. I don't know if Bilbo really, he was just sort of clapping back at Gloin. Gloin had said something rather rude to Bilbo, or I should say something rather rude about Bilbo that he heard, and and he decided that even though he didn't want to actually go on an adventure, he didn't like the idea that these guys thought that he wasn't good enough to do that, which I think is a very calculated thing from Gandalf, really, because Gandalf knows that Bilbo is capable of doing this. Otherwise, he wouldn't have chosen him. He does say that he wished he had gotten to Bilbo a lot sooner because Bilbo was not so much like he was as a child. He had become, I think Gandalf's exact word was fat and greedy, you know. So he didn't like the way that Bilbo was straying from the path that he had previously been on. So yeah, more like a grocer than a burglar. Gloin, out of all the dwarves, he was kind of the rudest one. Although the depiction of Thorin is incorrect in whether by Bilbo not realizing how rude Thorin was, or just deciding that because Thorin had died, that he was going to tone it down and sort of make him seem better than he was, um, because Gandalf's recollection was that Thorin was exceptionally nasty, but in both The Hobbit and the Search for Erebor, Gloin shows himself to have a rather acerbic tongue when it comes to not just Bilbo in particular, but hobbits in general. I think that the exact phrase that Gloin used in the the quest for Erebor, when Gandalf suggested using a hobbit, was that they were simpletons. They were simpletons from that land called the Shire, you know. And it's interesting that, when we get to the Lord of the Rings, out of the 13 dwarves, the only one that is actually in the Lord of the Rings is Gloin. And Gloin just has this quiet respect for Bilbo, and they're very close friends. So you can see that Bilbo really did win him over, just like he won Thorin over. I think he won all the dwarves over. I don't think any of them thought poorly of him at any point, after the Hobbit. I mean, I guess Philly and Killy didn't survive, but we know that he made up with Thorin. Thorin had some really beautiful words for him on his deathbed, so there is that. So yeah, so I gave you guys the update, and I answered some questions already. So let me actually bring that out. I wanted to. Here's Unfinished Tales, and let's see about if I can get to what Gloin said specifically. Oh, here we are. The Quest of Erebor. So the Quest of Erebor is essentially sort of a missing piece of the Return of the King, where it takes place after the fall of Sauron, during a period of time where Frodo is recuperating in Minas Tirith, and he has a bit of a meeting here along with Merry, Pippin, Sam, and Gimli, and they all have a talk with Gandalf, and a lot of really interesting things are revealed. Now, there's two different versions of this, so I'm sort of looking to see where it was that Gloin said what he thought of hobbits in general. And that doesn't seem to be in the first version. I could be wrong. The second version's much more, here it is, much more detailed. The first version's very brief. I'm going to read you this section here. "Professional stealth," cried Balin, taking up my words rather differently than I had meant them. "Do you mean a trained treasure seeker? Can they still be found?" I hesitated. This was a new turn, and I was not sure how to take it. "I think so," I said at last. "For a reward they will go in where you dare not, or at any rate cannot, and get what you desire." Thorin's eyes glistened as the memories of lost treasures moved to his mind. "But a paid thief, you mean," he said scornfully. "That might be considered if the reward was not too high. But what has all this got to do with one of these villagers? They drink out of clay, and they cannot tell a gem from a bead of glass." Oh, this might be after what Gloin said. Oh, yes, that's a little after. Well, that's what Thorin said. Here is what Gloin said. Let me go back to the previous page. Thorin should have been old. That's the thing that the films got very wrong. He was the oldest of the 13 dwarves, and sometimes people are so they're so swayed by the films, and it becomes difficult to find depictions of Thorin that are accurate, because if you go to, say, Google image search and you type in Thorin and art, you're going to get a lot of drawings that look exactly like, what's his name? I know his name. He's a Scottish actor. Not Graham McTavish, but he was in the movie. He was in The Hobbit. What was his name that played Thorin? I can't think of his name. But you'll see a lot of Thorins that look like that. You won't find very many old Thorins. So sometimes when I'm writing on Quora and I happen to mention, hey, yeah, Thorin was the oldest of the dwarves, they go, well, surely he wasn't older than Balin. And I'm like, yeah, he was a few years older than Balin. Here it is. You make your stealth sound as difficult and hopeless as any open attack, said Balin. Impossibly difficult. Yes, it is difficult, I answered, but not impossibly difficult, or I would not waste my time here. I would say absurdly difficult. So I am going to suggest an absurd solution to the problem. Take a hobbit with you. Smaug has probably never heard of hobbits, and he has certainly never smelt them. What? Cried Gloin. One of those simpletons down in the Shire. What use on earth or under it could he possibly be? Let him smell as he may, he would never dare to come within smelling distance of the nakedest dragon new from the shell. And what's interesting there is we get a little bit of, not only Gloin's sort of acerbic wit, but also a little bit of dragon lore there. That he said that dragons are sort of naked when they come out of their shell, meaning that they don't have their hardened scales yet. They don't have their protection. So basically, I don't know what you're asking, Time Lord Guy. RTR? I'm not sure what you're asking there. But anyway, in the Children of Húrin, there's a bit about Glaurung coming out of Morgoth's fortress when he was still very young and didn't yet have his armor. And so what we get with that is he got riddled full of arrows and he got pretty hurt, and Morgoth was not happy about it because he didn't want to reveal his new creation, a dragon, to the elves until a certain time, and he certainly did not want the dragon to get hurt or to do something that was against his will. So eventually, when Glaurung came out, he had very hard scales and everything. Of course, the dragons are weak on their bellies; they don't have scales down there. But since Glaurung was what we might refer to as an earthbound dragon or a drake, he did not have wings and he did not fly. So his belly was always against the ground. So really very difficult to fight that sort of thing. That's why Turin came up with the idea of, well, this guy stretches himself over gorges, when he crosses a river, he stretches himself over it. So me and two other guys will hide in this gorge and stab him in the heart as he pulls himself over, which did work, even though the other two guys, it didn't work out. He had two men with him when he went out to kill Glaurung. One of them gave up before they got to the river, just decided, no, I'm not doing this, and he turned back and went back to Brethil. And then the other one got killed by a rock falling, and he died. So, yeah. There you have it. Oh, you're not sure what rune... Well, right, what did Walter say? I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing where he said RTR. Oh, you're calling him RTR. Oh, I see. Oh, yeah. Well, here's the thing about the beards. So, this is something I'd like to address dwarf beards, actually, because the films got this really wrong. Not just The Hobbit, but The Lord of the Rings. And so there is this idea that Tolkien said at one point that all dwarves have beards. And they came to interpret this as lady dwarves having beards. And this is something that, even though it wasn't mentioned at all in The Lord of the Rings, it was brought into the films. And there's that scene where Gimli is saying, of course there are dwarf women. Dwarves don't spring out of holes in the ground, but, they look so much like dwarf men that, you couldn't tell the difference. And then Aragorn does this. He goes, it's the beards, which was a funny moment, but it is not actually lore accurate. What Tolkien actually said was that all male dwarves have beards. So he never said that female dwarves had beards. He said all dwarves have beards, and then later on he clarified what he said: the men have beards. I think that Tolkien, he always thought that people were smarter than they are, and He thought they were smarter than they are, really, and this goes across the board. And he thought, well, when I say something like all dwarves have beards, of course they'll know that I mean male dwarves. They won't think that the ladies have beards. That's ridiculous. And then everybody starts to think that, and he clarifies it later on. So, you know, dwarves, all of them have beards, and but not the women, just the men. You could read about that in um, both the peoples of Middle Earth and the nature of Middle Earth. The nature of Middle Earth is the one where it's clarified. But yeah, he never said that lady dwarves have beards. Um, but as for the styles of beards that they had, did Aule have a beard? I'm going to circle back to that, Walter. That's a good question. I'm going to circle back to that. If you look up Tolkien's art, because he was not just a writer and a professor and a poet and a linguist and a philologist, he was also an artist. And he mostly drew landscapes and, hey, Coyote, he mostly drew landscapes and what we would call sort of pastoral scenes and heraldic devices. He drew some creatures. He did draw Glaurung and he did draw Smaug, but he did not very often depict human type characters. He had a few drawings of Bilbo, and he had let's see, he had a few drawings of Bilbo, and he had one unfinished sketch of Sauron that was going to be the dust jacket cover of The Return of the King, but he didn't finish the drawing. Um, but he only drew elves as tiny little figures seen from a distance. But the one time that he drew dwarves, and it was a drawing, it was a sketch really to go along with the Hobbit. Their beards were actually very small, and they sort of jutted out like this. So, like, basically, this is what he was thinking of. So the big, bushy, long beards are not initially what he was thinking about, at least not in The Hobbit. Now, later on, he decided that most of the dwarves that we knew as very familiar characters were of a clan that we commonly refer to as Durin's folk, but are also called the Longbeards, so that they might have longer than average beards. Now, his drawings are not exactly always the most amazing things in the world, but it just sort of gives you a little bit of an insight into what he was thinking of. Now, let me answer. There was a question that came in here from Walter. Let's see. Did Aula have a beard? So I think it's interesting. Um, I we could go either way on this. I think it's meant to be open for interpretation. There are a lot of artistic depictions of Aula that draw him with a beard. And the reasoning behind that is that he created the dwarves, and as he did not have access to sort of the blueprints for how to make people, that he tried his best, and that he may have made the dwarves in his own image rather than the image of the elves. Um, and that's possible. He may have had a beard. Certainly, as one of the Valar, if he could just make himself have a full beard, or then the next moment he can choose to be completely clean shaven, or he could just have a mustache, or he could do the Frank Zappa look, or he could do any sort of different things that he wanted to. You know, um, the case against Aula having a beard is that the forms that the Ainur took, and specifically the Valar, were based off of the vision that they had of the children of Iluvatar that they saw briefly before the world was even created. Iluvatar showed them the world and they saw people in it, and that they made themselves look like those people, the elves, and that basically that's why the Valar look like elves, essentially. And elves almost never have beards. Now let's see if anybody knows in the chat. I'm going to ask you guys a bit of a trivia question. What are the two elves that are mentioned to have beards? And who is the third elf that wasn't specifically mentioned to have a beard, but may have had one? Okay, so a lot of people are saying Círdan. Matthew said Curran. I'm assuming, yeah, you corrected yourself. Círdan the Mariner absolutely had a beard. And we see this actually in The Return of the King. I'm going to bring that up here. I have to put you guys down so I can find the page, though. It's the last chapter, but the appendix makes it hard to find. Here we are. The Grey Havens. Here it is. Frodo and Sam halted and sat silent in the soft shadows until they saw a shimmer in as the travelers came towards them. There was Gildor and many fair elven folk, and there to Sam's wonder rode Elrond and Galadriel. Elrond wore a mantle of grey and had a star upon his forehead, and a silver harp was in his hand, and upon his finger was a ring of gold with a great blue stone, Vilya mightiest of the three. But Galadriel sat upon a white palfrey and was robed all in glimmering white, like clouds about the moon, for she herself seemed to shine with a soft light. On her finger was Nenya, the ring wrought of mithril, that bore a single white stone, flickering like a frosty star. Riding slowly behind on a small grey pony and seeming to nod in his sleep as Bilbo himself. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, as you get the descriptions of those two. But then let's go to Círdan. As they came to the gates, Círdan the shipwright came forth to greet them. Very tall he was, and his beard was long, and he was grey and old, save that his eyes were as keen as stars, and he looked at them and bowed and said, "All is now ready." So there we have it. So Círdan is specifically mentioned to have a beard in The Lord of the Rings. Let me scroll up here. The other two you don't know. Elros is not an elf. That's a good guess. Except we have to remember that Elros and all of his descendants did not have beards. Because of the bit of elvish ancestry. That's why Aragorn cannot grow a beard. It's why Faramir, who's very Númenorian, doesn't have a beard. So he would not have had a beard, no. Okay, so the other one is an elf called Matan, who actually was cut from the Silmarillion. I think he's a cousin of Galadriel's. And Matan was he was an elf that wasn't very old like Círdan, but was mentioned to have red hair and a red beard. Hey, Warmaster, how's it going? So this did not make it into the Silmarillion, but you can find it in the Histories of Middle-earth. I forget exactly which volume it is, but Matan is mentioned as having a beard. The third one, and this one's a little contentious, would be Gwyndor. Gwyndor was the elf that Finduilas was actually going to be married to. She was engaged to Gwyndor, and then he was captured by Morgoth. And when he was rescued, he was all scarred up and he had become old due to the partial fading of Morgoth torturing him. It wasn't mentioned specifically that he had a beard, but it is certainly possible. Let's see. Here's a question from Time Lord going. Were the badger folk in the poem helped in their evolution by Tom in the poem? Oh, so you're referring to... Let me grab the book. Oh, that's not it. Where is it? There it is. You're referring to The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. And I think specifically The poem that you're talking about is called Bombadil Goes Boating. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Let's see, Perry the Winkle, The Man in the Moon, Princess Smee, Errantry. Love Errantry, great poem. Bombadil Goes Boating. Here it is. The old year was turning brown, the west wind was calling. Tom caught a beechen leaf in the forest falling. I've caught a happy day, blown me by the breezes. Why wait till morrow year? I'll take it when me pleases. This day I'll mend my boat and journey as it chances, west down the Withy stream, following my fancies. Little bird said on twig, Hello, willow Tom, I heed you. I've a guessed where your fancies lead you. Shall I go, bring him word to meet you. No names you tell tale, or I'll skin and eat you, babbling in every ear things that don't concern you. If you tell Willow Man where I've gone, I'll burn you, roast you on a willow spit, that'll end your prying. Willow Wren cocked her tail, piped as she went flying. Catch me first, no names are needed. I'll perch on this ither ear, the message we'll be heeding. Down the Mithy, I'll say, just as sun is seeking. Hurry up, that's the time for drinking. Tom laughed to himself, maybe then I'll go there. I might go by other ways, but today I'll row there. He shaved oars, patched his boat from hidden creaky holder, through reed and shallow brake under leaning alder. Then down the river went singing silly sallow, flow with the willow stream over deep and shallow. Okay, let me turn the page here. This is difficult to do with one hand, guys, so I hope you appreciate the effort. We, Tom Bombadil, whither you be going? Bobbing in a cockle boat down the river rowing, maybe to Brandywine along the Withy Windle, maybe friends of mine fire for me will kindle, down by the Hayes folk, little folk I know there, kind at the day's end, now and then I go there. Take word to my kin, bring me back their tidings, tell me of diving pools and the fishes' hidings. Nay then, said Bombadil, I am only rowing, just to smell the water like, not an errand's going. Tee cocky Tom, mind your tub, don't founder. Look out for willows, snags, I'd laugh to see you flounder. Talk less, fisher blue, take your kindly wishes. Fly off and preen yourself with the bones of fishes. Gay lord on your bow, at home a dirty varlet, living in a sloven house, through your breast be scarlet. I've heard a fisher bird's beak in air a dangling, to show how the wind is set. That's an end of angling. So it goes on. And basically, the story of Bombadil Goes Boating is that he's going down to what we would understand Buckland, and he's just getting annoyed in every sort of way by all these talking animals, birds and fish and beavers and such, and they're all just sort of annoying him. And what we have to understand about the poems that are about Bombadil specifically I don't want to use the word canon because we were talking about how that's a bad sort of word to use when we're talking about Tolkien, but they're not something that we're supposed to understand actually happened in Middle Earth. These are stories about Bombadil told by the hobbits, and I believe that particular poem was something that Sam wrote. And if you think of the little bit of Bombadil that Sam knew him for, this is sort of, the way that he operates from Sam's perspective, that anything goes, sort of awry or irritates him. He sort of boasts and threatens and says all the terrible things he's going to do, like when he said all the things that he was going to do to Old Man Willow when it had Merry and Pippin in his mouth, So basically, talking animals are really not that unusual in Middle Earth. We know there are birds that talk. We know that there are, obviously, there are eagles that talk, although they may be Maiar spirits. But it's really not that unusual. But in this case, it's probably exaggerated. It's a bit of Hobbit verse, and it's all something that probably Sam wrote that poem. Now, let me see. Okay, Walter asked me, let's see. Why would Alatar be permitted by the Valar to bring a friend? Unlike the other Istari, he most certainly assumed that I think you mean Kuranur must have had friends as well as Radagast. Well, here's the thing. Saruman, whatever his name was in the West, whether it was Kuramo or Tarandor, he didn't have friends. He was not a friendly guy. As a matter of fact, Radagast was supposedly sent to Middle Earth to be Saruman's friend, and he did not like that idea. Um, I think the only reason that like the Alatar was allowed to take a friend because he asked. Gandalf didn't ask to take a friend. Radagast didn't ask to take a friend. So basically, I sort of think of Alatar and Polando, the two blue wizards, as sort of like a holdover from some of the earlier scrapped Valar that I talked about in a recent video. And there was one group. There were two Valar, a man and a woman, that were brother and sister, and they were sort of attached at the hip. Where one went, the other went. And I think we're just seeing that sort of companionship between the Blue Wizards, that almost like Frodo and Sam. Like, of course you're going alone, and I'm going with you. So that Alatar was sort of saying, "Hey, I'd be happy to go, but can I bring Polando with me?" You know. So I think that's really what it is. Is there any real description of Eru? No. No, there's no description of Eru. The closest that we get is just that the secret fire flows out of him. We don't know what he's supposed to look like. We really don't know what the Ainur are supposed to look like, because as people, as flesh beings, as the children of Iluvatar, we can't see them. They're invisible. They have to choose to have a body that is physical, that we can see, and they could make themselves look like us, or they could, have all these other forms of dread and majesty, or if they could go naked, which essentially means that they don't have a physical body and we therefore can't see them. We can understand that they can see each other, but we don't ever get any sort of description of what Eru Iluvatar would look like. And he doesn't ever actually enter into the world. When he speaks to Aule, he's speaking to him from outside the circles of the world. When he breaks the world and reshapes it, he's doing that from where he is. Because Tolkien was rather specific that Iluvatar would only enter into the world as a physical being as Jesus. And that hasn't happened yet in the Silmarillion or in the Lord of the Rings. So basically, I think that Tolkien felt it would probably be improper to actually describe what God looks like. So he did not include a description. But what's really interesting about Tolkien, because he's sort of known for descriptions, but he's not known for descriptions of people. If I asked you, what color is Legolas's hair, you would say, "Oh, I don't actually know. It's not mentioned in the book." What color is Legolas's hair? Who knows? I think it is very likely that he did have blonde hair, simply because we know his father was blonde. That doesn't mean that he necessarily was, but it's a good indicator that he probably looked somewhat like his father. But there are a lot of things that are just not described with characters. He was pretty good at telling us what the character's hair color was, unless it was a hobbit. We were just meant to assume that hobbits have brown hair because they usually did. But he did not usually describe features all that much. For example, he would just say that Aragorn was just sort of weathered looking and sort of flushed of complexion, and just covered in nicks and bruises and cuts, and that he was kind of dirty, and that but that's it. We don't know anything beyond that. We know he didn't have a beard. We know that Faramir has black hair. But there are a lot of like, we don't know what color Gimli's hair was. We don't really know what a lot of the characters look like, because he doesn't spend a lot of time describing them, other than the important things that we're meant to know. Like, for example, Galadriel is blonde. That's very important to her character because of the arc with her and her uncle Feanor and the Silmarils and everything. So Celeborn has silver hair. His name means silver tree, so it's sort of important there. But usually we don't get great descriptions of what the characters actually look like, and that includes Eru. It includes the Valar. The one spirit character that's described the most, well, there's two, is Gandalf and Saruman. We know that they sort of look like each other. We know that Saruman once had all black hair, but that as he aged, the only black hair he had was around his mouth and his ears. We know that Gandalf has big bushy eyebrows, so we know a few things, but yeah, does Gollum have a description? So, it's interesting about Gollum is that it became very popular. And I'm gonna circle back to you, Walter, because that's an interesting question. It became very popular to depict Gollum as basically being naked. And I think a lot of that came from The Hobbit when he was just described as this creature, and it wasn't yet introduced that he used to be a hobbit. Um, there is a lot of going back and forth about the shade of Gollum's skin, in that sometimes he is described as being pale, and sometimes he is described as being black. And Tolkien actually did clear this all up, and he said that Gollum had black hair, and he wore black clothing. He was not naked. He wore black clothing, but that his skin was very, very pale. So that's why you see descriptions of him as being sort of a black creature, and also you get descriptions of him as having pale skin. He's not naked. He doesn't really look like a hobbit, but he is meant to sort of be, almost fish-like. He had, in his description, in the description that is given in The Hobbit and in The Lord of the Rings as well. And we there is a scene where Sam sort of looks at him and sort of, or maybe it was Frodo. I think it was both of them actually. They sort of saw him in a different light. That's why I think it might have been Sam, because Sam had a knack of seeing things in a different light. It's there's no reason that should have been. Oh. Time Lord Guy, your message got hidden, and when I'm trying to show it, it's telling me error, try again. There's nothing wrong with what you said. I just think that, like, because of The Hobbit, he was often drawn as being this sort of naked creature who, at most, would have like a little loincloth on. And then when the Lord of the Rings films came out, that just cemented it, and that's how people see him. When in fact he would have been wearing some sort of tunic and breeches. Um, as a matter of fact, they probably would have been in pretty bad shape, I think. But he also probably learned to mend his own clothing. So there is that. Now, I wanted to circle back to what Walter asked here. What was the most brutal death to an individual character within the Legendarium? It's subjective, but there are three that come to mind. They're all elves. Elves always had the hardest deaths, it seemed. Actually, there are four that come to mind, but they're still all elves. The first one that I immediately thought of was Finduilas. Finduilas was an elf in the story The Children of Húrin. I mentioned her earlier. She was going to marry Gwyndor, and then Gwyndor was captured by Morgoth, and he was tortured, and he became very old and scarred, and almost nobody recognized him. And she sort of fell in love with Turin Turambar after that, although they never got to be together because she died, and the manner in which she died was very, very brutal. The orcs nailed her to a tree with their spears. So that's pretty brutal. The second one that I think of immediately is Celebrimbor. Celebrimbor was personally killed by Sauron with a spear, and if you saw the TV show, they did a pretty accurate depiction of the way that he died in Sauron, impaling him. But they didn't go full Silmarillion brutal, because once he had Fingolfin at the end of his spear, he started attacking other elves using Celebrimbor's body as a bludgeon on the end of this long pike, which is just a terrible thought to think of. So that's another really brutal one. The third one that I think of is Fingon. Fingon was smoked by Gothmog's axe, and he fell to the ground, and then the Balrogs trampled him to death, and they just stepped on him and just played with his body until he was nothing but dust and blood. That's a really brutal one. And the last one that I would mention would be Gil-galad, who was grabbed by Sauron's burning hand and then died of his burns shortly after that. No, yeah, it's definitely something the ring did to him because Storish hobbits are actually the hobbits that look the most like men. They are the only hobbits that can grow beards, and they have larger hands and larger feet. They basically just look like small men. They're probably the oldest of the three types of hobbit. Um, the Fallowhides are interestingly almost like little tiny elves, and then of course the Harfoots are like the ones that we're the most familiar with. They're the ones with the darker skin, and they're just sort of just look like little people. And that's like the sort of hobbit that Frodo would be, for example. So Gollum, he didn't always look like a fish. That's something the ring did to him. What do I think of the? I think you mean Avari, the Avari elves. So the only thing, the Avari elves, Avari basically means the refusers. They're the ones who, when Orima said, "Hey, let's go on a journey to the west," they said, "Yeah, miss me with that. No, I'm not interested." They generally did not trust Orima because they didn't really see the difference between him and Melkor. They didn't know that he wasn't Melkor. And they were said to just basically live in these little enclaves in various places in Middle Earth, in the forests and such. We do know that they did do what they were supposed to do, in that they were the ones who greeted men when we first awakened in the world. And the Avari elves were the ones that greeted us, and they taught us culture and they taught us language. Um, but by the time the first stage is over, we really don't hear anything about the Avari elves. We know a lot of what happened to the various Noldor elves. We know a lot of Teleri. There's so many Teleri out there. Because there's so many different types of Teleri elves. And we don't know a lot about the Vanyar because they all stayed in the Undying Lands. They were the only ones that all went to the Undying Lands. But the Avari don't concern themselves much in the stories. They didn't fight Morgoth. They're not involved in anything in the Second Age or the Third Age. Am I interested in the Bavarium fragments? Actually, I don't think I know what that is, to be honest with you. But yeah, I think the Avari sort of just they were probably the elves that we would most that they would most be like would be the specific type of Teleri elves called the Sylvan elves, which are the elves that mostly lived in places like Lothlorien and Mirkwood. Um, that's probably the most similar that they were to the Avari. That those are probably the biggest point of reference. But yeah, I wanted to talk about, let's go back to the idea of canon. We talked about it a little bit early on about how canon is sort of this dubious thing. It's hard to say if anything is canon because almost anything that Tolkien wrote, he changed his mind on at least once. One of the biggest examples of this is what exactly are the Great Eagles? And very early on, he intended them to be Maiar spirits that took the form of birds. And then later on, he said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to make it where they're just animals of a higher order. They can speak human speech. They're really big. They live a long time, but they're not angels. But then late in life, he changed his mind back. And he said that they were indeed angels. They were of the Maiar. and that they specifically answered only to Manwë, which actually helps make the ending of The Lord of the Rings make more sense if they are angels and that they are beholden only to Manwë, especially about the way that Gwaihir interacted with Gandalf the last time that they spoke. So you can see that, authors have, every right to change their minds and they have every right to contradict themselves. But here's the issue. During Tolkien's lifespan, he published The Hobbit. He published The Fellowship of the Ring. He published The Two Towers. And he published The Return of the King. And he published a bunch of poems, too. Everything else came out after he died. The Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, all 12 volumes of the Histories of Middle-earth, all of the Great Tales, everything else came out after he died. He never finished his work, and he knew that he would never finish his work. He never intended to actually finish his work. He always intended that other people would take it on after him, which is sort of like what we talked about earlier about the Arthurian legend and how there isn't anything that's canon or anything that's non-canon. There are only classics. There are stories about King Arthur, or about Merlin, or about Guinevere, or about Lancelot that we all agree are really good. Bonnie Bell Plumbottom, thank you for joining as a member. Welcome. And my friend Matt, he talks about you all the time. He just loves the name Bonnie Bell Plumbottom, and he'll just say it out of nowhere. He goes, "Oh, I wonder what Bonnie Bell Plumbottom thinks." How is it going? Thank you for joining. That really means a lot to me. So basically what I'm getting at here is there are stories that we agree we like and that are the better ones, in terms of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table and Merlin and Guinevere and Lancelot and all that. And and those are the important stories, but they don't necessarily all have anything to do with each other, and they certainly don't have anything to do with the other stories. So basically, anybody could tell a story about King Arthur, or Merlin, or Morgana Le Fay, or Guinevere, or Tristan, or any of these other characters. You could write a story, and it is of equal validity to all of the great tales that like The Sword and the Stone, or the Fall of Arthur, or whatever else that's out there. And that's why there's so many different versions. And Tolkien sort of wanted to create something like that. Not exactly that, but like that. Where there would be tales that would be told that may not have happened exactly that way, but they're stories about the characters. The Book of Lost Tales, we know what it really is. It's his early drafts of the Silmarillion. But what does it exist as in terms of the Legendarium? Stories that are told about the First Age by men. This is how the story of the First Age is told in Numenor. This is how the story of the First Age is told in Gondor. Bonnie Bell, thank you for the donation there, the tip, I should say. That's $10 Canadian. I'm not sure what that translates to in USD, but it'll be in my feed. Thank you very much. What is that little icon? Oh, it's like a little guy there. I always thought it almost looked like a goose, and I was like, oh, Canadian dollars, a goose. Thank you very much for the super chat there. King Arthur is a case where every English culture added to the myth. Not only that, but I mean, a lot of it wasn't English. A lot of it was Welsh, or if you mean English speaking, there are takes on there are takes on King Arthur that are not English. Anybody, like I said, anybody could write a story about it, and Tolkien wanted that to be true of the Legendarium, with just certain stipulations that anybody who writes about it sort of writes it in this sort of high fantasy style, and that it would be sort of vaguely Celtic. Yes, absolutely. There is a lot of French stuff in The Matter of Britain. There was a lot of French versions. As a matter of fact, the Fall of Arthur is based off of a French story called Le Mort d'Arthur, the death of King Arthur. You know, so there you have it. You know, and Tolkien himself dabbled in translating the Fall of Arthur. He translated Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is one of my favorite stories from Arthurian legend. But anyway, so the author changes his mind a lot, you know, so we have to throw the idea of canon or non-canon out of the window. Now, I'm not going to put anybody on blast here. I'm not going to name any names, even though sometimes I get sorely tempted to, you know. But basically, let me tell you guys a little story when I first met Matt. Of course, Matt Richardson of the Council of Tolkien. So Matt is a writer on Quora, just much like I am. Except he doesn't actually use his real name on there. He calls himself Lore Master. So, so imagine me. I'm sitting there, you know, and I've been studying Tolkien for a long time, but I'm new to Quora, and this is about 2.5 years ago, and I'm writing stuff, and suddenly I start getting comments from this guy calling himself Lore Master, you know, and he's just sort of a weird guy, you know, in my opinion at this time. And he starts leaving me comments telling me that he really needs to speak to me. And this is basically how I met Matt, is that, you know, he left me his phone number in a comment, which I thought, oh my God, he just put his phone number on the internet like that. And I was like, I'll come back to that, and I guess I'll call him and talk to him and see what the deal is, right? But then the comment was gone. He realized, wait, then maybe that's not a good idea, and he took it off, you know. But eventually, I did get in touch with him, and I talked to him, and you know, he's a great guy, as you guys know how much I like Matt, you know. But he just has a persona, you know. He's a character, you know, on Quora. But he told me that his idea was to put together a group of people called the Nine, that would be sort of a writers guild on Tolkien, and that we would write for each other and sort of review each other's articles and papers as sort of a peer review group. And you know, and he asked me. It was the three of us to start. It was me and Matt and another guy named Jeffrey Claburn. And Jeffrey doesn't do much writing anymore, so he's not actually in our group anymore because he's less concerned with writing and more concerned with running his group, which is perfectly fine. He does an excellent job at what he does. He's more of a, you know, interested in moderating his group on Quora. But anyway, you know. So you know, Jeffrey was out after a bit because he wasn't really writing, and we invited Sid, and Sid sort of became the third leader. But the conversations early on between me and Matt and Matt and Sid, you know, this is before I actually spoke with Sid or met him, but I knew of him, you know, and you know, Matt said we have you know, Matt's the leader, by the way, of this whole thing, because this was all his idea. Sometimes people assume that I'm the leader of the Nine. I'm the leader of the Council of Tolkien because it's my channel and my podcast. But as far as the writing group goes, that's Matt's thing, and he's in charge of it. Me and Sid are sort of like his lieutenants, you know. But anyway, he said, "Who do you want to be involved in this? Like, can you name any names of people that you think are really good that you would like to see join us? And also, equally importantly, is there anybody out there that you don't want involved?" And he said, "Well, actually, I can think of a few guys that shouldn't be involved, not because they don't know their stuff, but because of their personalities, that they're very confrontational and very sort of arrogant." And there's this one guy. I'm not going to put him on blast. I'm not going to say his name because I don't think he's a bad guy, and I don't want it to seem like I'm really just dogging on him. But him and me don't see eye to eye on this canon thing, and that's the main contention thing. he's very quick to swoop in and say, that's not canon. And I would say at that point, well, what is canon? You know? And the one thing that he gets very stuck on is the book Morgoth's Ring. And in Morgoth's Ring, there is a section called Myths Transformed. And some of the things that are in there are really, really amazing, genius things that Tolkien came up with that it does a lot to explain some of the deeper mysteries of his legendarium, of how the elves work, of how Middle Earth works, of how everything works. And then there are some ideas in there that are wacky. And basically, because very late in his life, he had the idea that the Silmarillion itself was not something that really happened in Middle Earth. That it's just a fairy tale that the elves tell, much like the Book of Lost Tales is a fairy tale that the men tell. So if the Book of Lost Tales is the story of the First Age, the way it is told in Numenor and Gondor, it's the Mannish version, and then the Silmarillion is the Elvish version, which we always thought was the truer version because elves are immortal and they write something down. And if 6,000 years later, 8,000 years later, you have a question about something in there, you could still ask the guy that wrote it because he's still alive. Whereas with men who are mortal, we die, the stories change over time, and there's no way to go back and ask somebody who was around 8,000 years ago what they meant about something. You can't, you can't even go back a few hundred years. You can't ask Shakespeare any questions because Shakespeare is dead. So what I'm getting at here is we always took it as the elves were correct and that the men were correct in sort of a very broad strokes way. These events essentially happened, but not in, all those details were sort of made up along the way. And they got some things wrong, like about Balrogs and such. Let me catch up on chat before I go further here. If you're interested in that, Walter, I could put you in contact with Matt. I gotta look at your writing though before I recommend you to Matt. You know, I gotta look at your writing, and then like I would look at your writing, and Matt would look at your writing, and Sid would look at your writing, and if we all three of us give a thumbs up, then we would say, yeah, come on, join. But and there have been people, by the way, there have been people that all three of us agreed with that said no anyway. Like there was this one guy named Louis, and I said, what about Louis? Louis is pretty great. Why don't we talk to him? And then and Matt agreed that Louis was great, but Sid didn't know him, so we had to wait for Sid to read his stuff and then give a thumbs up. And then Louis was like, "Wow, guys, that's really great, but I don't have time to do that. I don't think I could be involved in that. But thank you anyway." And we're like, "Okay, that's cool. We can't force you. If you don't have the time, you don't have the time. He's a busy guy. But anyway, getting back to it, at some point Tolkien had the idea that the truth of what happened in the first age was in some ways incredibly mundane compared to what the elves wrote. And one example of this is that there were never any lamps, there were never any trees. They did not exist, which makes you wonder if the Silmarils themselves even existed, right? Um, which the answer to that would be probably not. The sun and the moon have always existed. They were created alongside the earth, and that they are celestial bodies that are really far away. They're not carried by angels. The sun is not going back and forth. We're revolving around it. He basically decided at one point to make it realistic. And Matt is of the opinion, as we talked about this not too long ago, that if Tolkien had lived longer, he may have changed his mind again, which of course he would have, because he always changed his mind. Um, so in some ways, it sort of took all the magic and wonder out of it. But then there are other ideas found in there that are really, really wild, One of which was that Morgoth's fortress, Angband, was on the moon, which would make me think, does that mean that the War of Wrath happened on the moon? How did they get there? The elves and everything. How did that work? And how did that play into the lost land of Beleriand, you know? So, yeah, Morgoth's moon base. It's completely bonkers. It's something, it's cartoonish almost, right? So there were a lot of ideas that Tolkien had that never made it into any kind of story. He had an outline of some things that he was thinking about changing. And then you get a guy like the one person, I'm not going to say his name, like I said, because I don't want to make it seem like I'm bagging on the guy, but he thinks that every idea that Tolkien had is is what canon is, and that if he didn't write it, it can't possibly be canon, and that if he did write it, it has to be canon, and that if anything contradicts anything else, then you just go by what the later thing was. Which, and I said, well, that just invalidates the whole Silmarillion. It invalidates about half of the Lord of the Rings, and basically then nothing is true. And that's where we differ you know and it's okay to differ, it's okay to have different opinions. The reason that I don't personally get along with this guy is that he becomes very insulting, which I don't appreciate, but there you have it. But I wanted to grab the book, I wanted to grab Morgoth's Ring and open to that section, and maybe not drop all my books on the floor, and maybe read a bit of some of that outline stuff. So that's Sin Part 3, right? Okay. So here I have the History of Middle-earth Part 3, which was originally 3 separate books, the first of which was called Morgoth's Ring. There's also The War of the Jewels and the Peoples of Middle-earth. So if Tolkien wrote the rules, he'd have the right to change them. Absolutely. But what I'm saying is, there's a lot of crazy ideas that he had. I didn't even get into it all, about there being other planets where there are other sets of Valar, you know? And it was just an idea that he had. He never wrote it into any story. It was just something that he wrote down. Hey, wouldn't it be cool if, there were other planets that had Valar on them, and that they had their own group of people that they were looking after? And and then this one person on Quora is taking this as being absolutely true in the context of like the Lord of the Rings, and I'm like, well, that's just an idea that Tolkien had. It never made it into a story. I don't really think that we have to, you know, go by that, because what parts of the Lord of the Rings would it invalidate? Basically anything that references the First Age, anything that all the mentions of Beren and Luthien, and stealing the Silmaril off of Morgoth's crown and Earendil's star, which we see a reflection of that in the File of Galadriel, but there were no Silmarils, right? It's just sort of crazy to argue about these things. Did Tolkien like science fiction? He loved science fiction. As a matter of fact, the idea of Numenor came from a science fiction story that he started writing called The Lost Road. Him and C.S. Lewis had a writing challenge together. They challenged each other to write a science fiction story. And in true C.S. Lewis fashion, he wrote, completed, and published a book out of this challenge, and then it got a few sequels. It was called Out of the Silent Planet. And in true Tolkien fashion, he started it, did not finish it, and then took the ideas and put them into other things. And it was called The Lost Road, which was a time travel story about people who were, very advanced, going back to this mythical land called Numenor, which was sort of loosely based off of Atlantis. And then he decided he wasn't going to finish it because he really rather, never finished anything other than, The Hobbit. As a matter of fact, The Lord of the Rings wasn't finished. I'm going to just be real with you. Tolkien himself said, it's too short, it's not detailed enough, it's missing a lot of things. I never got to finish it. And you think, well, why didn't he get to finish it? And the answer to that is C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was bugging him because, Tolkien would have just continued writing the story until he died. He never would have published it. And he would say, this is great, give us a story. This is great, finish it. And Lewis said about Tolkien that he is a procrastinator and a perfectionist, and it was only by an act of great midwifery that we got the Lord of the Rings. And if you understand midwifery, basically saying that Tolkien was giving birth to his story and that C.S. Lewis was the midwife telling him to breathe and push and get this baby out of him already. So there you have it. So I'm going to put this down momentarily while I find the section of Morgoth's ring that I need. So enjoy looking at the ceiling while I... Here we are, page 367. All right. That's too far. All right. Hi. Let's read a bit of Myths Transformed. In this last section of the book, I give a number of late writings of my father's, various in nature, but concerned with, broadly speaking, the reinterpretation of central elements in the mythology, or legendarium as he called it, to accord with the imperatives of a greatly modified underlying conception. Some of these papers, there are notable exceptions, offer exceptional difficulty, fluidity of ideas, ambiguous and elusive expression, illegible passages. But the greatest problem is that there is very little firm indication of date, external or relative. To order them into even an approximate sequence of composition seems impossible, though I believe that virtually all of them come from the years that we saw the writings of laws and customs among the Eldar and Athrabeth, and late revisions of parts of the Quenta Silmarillion, the late 1950s, in the aftermath of the publication of The Lord of the Rings. In these writings can be read the record of a prolonged interior debate. Years before this time, the first signs have been seen of emerging ideas that, if pursued, would have caused massive disturbance to the Silmarillion. I have shown, as I believe, that when my father first began to revise and rewrite the existing narratives of the elder days before The Lord of the Rings was completed, he wrote a version of the Ainu Lindala that introduced a radical transformation of the astronomical myth, but that for the time he stayed his hand. But now, as will be seen in many of the essays and notes that follow, he had come to believe that such a vast upheaval was a necessity, that the cosmos of the old myth was no longer valid, and at the same time he was impelled to try to construct a more secure theoretical or systematic basis for elements in the legendarium that were not to be dislodged. With their questionings, their certainties giving way to doubt, their contradictory resolutions, these writings are to be read with a sense of intellectual and imaginative stress in the face of such dismantling and reconstruction, believed to be an inescapable necessity, but never to be achieved. The texts, arranged in a very loose thematic sequence, are numbered in Roman numerals. Almost all have received very minor editing, matters of punctuation, insertion of omitted words, and such like. Numbered notes, not present in all cases, follow the individual texts. Let's pause here and just say, even Christopher Tolkien, of course, was the very first Tolkien scholar, even when he was young. And he's saying, yeah, if this stuff is true, it kind of destroys the Silmarillion, but that my father thought maybe we should do that and start from scratch. All right, let me catch up on chat here. Yeah, Shepard, he had some wacky ideas. And like I said, not everything that he wrote was meant to be put into a story. Like I said, during his lifetime, he published The Hobbit, he published The Lord of the Rings, and everything else came out later because he had thousands upon thousands of pages of notes, some of which were so illegible that, you couldn't even make out what he was saying, One of the great injustices is that there are no pictures of photos of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis together. For whatever reason, they were never photographed together. They spent a lot of time together, though. They were very great friends, Christopher, he almost deified his father's work, and that's both to its detriment and to its credit. I first give a short statement. Oh, this is the first part, part one. I first give a short statement written on two slips found pinned to one of the typescripts of the Annals of Aemon, which are dated to 1958 or later, if my general conclusions about dating are correct. So now we're switching over to J.R.R. Tolkien. All of that previously was Christopher. This descends from the oldest forms of the mythology, when it was still intended to be no more than another primitive mythology, though more coherent and less savage. It was consequently a flat earth cosmogony, much easier to manage anyway. The matter of Numenor had not yet been devised. It is now clear to me that in any case the mythology must actually be a mannish affair. Men are really only interested in men and in men's ideas and visions. The high Eldars living and being tutored by the demiurgic beings must have been known, or at least their riders and lore masters must have known, the truth, according to their measure of understanding. What we have in the Silmarillion, etc., are traditions, especially personalized and centered upon actors such as Feanor, handed on by the men in Numenor and later in Middle-earth, Arnor and Gondor, but already far back, from the first association of the Dunedain and elf friends with the Eldar and Beleriand, blended and confused with their own mannish myths and cosmic ideas. At that point, in reconsideration of the earlier cosmogonic parts, I have inclined to adhere to the flat earth and astronomically absurd business of the making of the sun and moon. But you can make up stories of that kind when you live among people who have the same general background of imagination, when the sun really rises in the east and goes down in the west, etc. And when, however, no matter how little most people know or think about astronomy, it is in the general belief that we live upon a spherical island in space. You cannot do this anymore. One loses, of course, the dramatic impact of such things as the first incarnates waking in a starlit world, or the coming of the high elves to Middle-earth and unfurling their banners at the first rising of the moon. So that's Tolkien's first note there. So you can see that even Tolkien was saying, hey, yeah, I some of that stuff is really great storytelling, but, maybe it doesn't make a lot of sense in the sense of, if we're to really believe that this is a mythological history of our world, there was never a time when people really thought the earth was flat. That's something that, is a myth that we were taught in schools, that people thought the world was flat until they realized it was round. And one of the things that we learn as we go beyond the typical like sort of education is that we always kind of knew the world was round, and he's just saying that this does a lot of damage to the Silmarillion, but maybe we can understand that this is a little bit of Elvish tradition and a lot of mannish meddling to create these stories that are really just stories and not necessarily the exact way that things happened. And this is how he comes up with these ideas, which I say that some of it is very mundane and it can be sort of depressing in its mundanity. But at the same time, he comes up with wacky ideas like Angband being on the moon. So let me catch up a little bit here. Tolkien's grave, yeah, him and his wife are buried together. It's pretty easy to find, if you're in the Oxford area. People will generally, point you toward where the Tolkiens are buried, and you could see how it says Beren and Luthien on the graves. Would the riders of Oromip, possibly Altar and Palando, have been burning hounds of their own, like Juan? Wait, who had burnt? I'm not sure what you're asking there. Hunting hounds. Okay. Yeah, not burning or brining. Yeah, I don't think that Juan was the only one like that. I think he's just the one that got given to an elf. You know? I don't think that he was the only one of his kind, essentially. So, let me put you guys down as I find the next section that I want to read. So there's a bit more of Tolkien's notes in section one and a lot of Christopher's musings on it, but let's go over to section two. And here's what Christopher says about section two. This is a text of a most problematic nature, a manuscript in ink that falls into two parts which are plainly very closely associated, a discussion with proposals for the regeneration of the mythology, and an abandoned narrative. Neither has title or heading. So now we switch over to Tolkien himself. The making of the sun and moon must occur long before the coming of the elves, and cannot be made to be after the death of the two trees. If that occurred in any connection with the sojourn of the Noldor and Valinor, the time allowed is too short. Neither there could be woods and flowers and sea upon earth, if there had been no light since the overthrow of the lamps. But how can, nonetheless, the Eldar be called the Starfolk? Since the Eldar are supposed to be wiser and have truer knowledge of the history and nature of the earth than men, or than wild elves, their legends should have a closer relation to the knowledge now possessed of at least the form of the solar kingdom, the kingdom of Arda, though it need not, of course, follow any scientific theory of its making or development. It therefore seems clear that the cosmogonic mythology should represent Arda as it is more or less, an island in the void amidst the innumerable stars. The sun should be coeval with the earth, though its relative size need not be considered, while the apparent revolution of the sun about the earth will be accepted. The stars, therefore, in general, will be other and remoter parts of the great tale of Ea, which do not concern the Valar of Arda. Though, even if not explicitly, it will be an underlying assumption that the kingdom of Arda is of central importance, selected amid all the immeasurable vast of Ea as the scene of the main drama of the conflict of Melkor with Iluvatar and the children of Eru. Melkor is the supreme spirit of pride and revolt, not just the chief Vala of the earth who has turned to evil. Turning the page here. Varda, therefore, as one of the great Valar of Arda, cannot be said to have kindled the stars as an original sub-creative act, not at least the stars in general. The story, it seems, should follow such a line as this: the entry of the Valar into Ea at the beginning of time, the choosing of the kingdom of Arda as their chief abiding place by the highest and most noblest of the Ainur, to whom Iluvatar had intended to commit the care of the Eruhini. Manwë and his companions elude Melkor and begin the ordering of Arda, but Melkor seeks for them, and at last finds Arda, and contends kingship with Manwë. So here you see sort of some of his ideas here. We can't. He starts to get into this bug in his head about, well, how could there be trees and plants and flowers before there was a sun and a moon? How does that make sense? And and he's not content to just say, well, that's just the magic of the Valar, or, he's not content to say that. And maybe he got tired of people writing him letters asking this sort of thing. And he said, well, maybe, there was a sun and a moon the whole time. And the story that we're told of Middle Earth being in darkness and the elves awakening under the stars, which were created by Varda, was just sort of a myth that they came up with. What is my favorite artifact from the whole history of Arda? What would your definition of artifact be? You know? Hey, Medio. As far as you're concerned, only some of the ancient people, like Egyptians, figured out the world was round. As soon as we started sailing the ocean, we knew. So basically, that's when we knew. As soon as we started dealing with anything to do with traveling around the oceans, that's when man realized the Earth was round. All the navigational tools used on ship would not work if they believed that the Earth was flat. They'd be very different, you know. Um, and William Stone there is correct about historical revisionism. Is very important, actually. Uh, any crafted item. Okay, so a crafted unfortunate. Okay, so oh, Nicholas, I'll answer that in a moment. I talked about it earlier, but I'll answer you in a moment. Um, the idea of An artifact. My favorite artifact. I mean, that's sort of a strange question. Uh, I mean, it's just sort of. I think the Palantiri is sort of my favorite because they're sort of fascinating in the way that they work and all the rules about them and all the good and the bad that come from using them. The crowdfunding is going really well. At this point, I'm basically waiting for the money that is in the GoFundMe campaign to basically clear and go into my bank account, at which point I'm going to send $1,200 to my friend in California who's going to build a computer for me and then send it back to me. Um, What's really cool about the Palantiri is we don't actually know who made them. It's often said that Feanor made them, and that might be true. It might be true, but we have to remember that the source of this was Gandalf, and that he was only guessing. He said they were made a long time ago by the elves, perhaps even Feanor himself. So yeah. So basically, just to catch everybody up on the crowdfunding stuff, because I did talk about it very early on in the stream, but I basically have the money for the computer. There are still a few other expenses that I'm going to incur, but I know that the GoFundMe doesn't seem to be at the goal, but there was money that came through on PayPal, so I'm including that. But I have to wait. The GoFundMe stuff, like it says, the transfer is pending. I don't know how long it takes. You got pizza? You can't just say you got pizza and not tell me details. I want details about this pizza. I had roast pork, by the way, today. Roast pork and hash browns. It was very, very good. So, and thank you for everybody that donated. And by the way, Bonnie Bell, since you joined as a member during a stream, I think I should do a little reading for you. Is there anything in particular you'd like me to read? Yeah. So stretch goals would include some of the things I'm going to need for the computer to replace things that are not going to be in it, like basically an optical drive, and I'm going to need a new USB hub and a few other things. But yeah, had some Hawaiian food. Very interesting. Very interesting. But I want to know about this pizza. And Bonnie Bell Plum Bottom, if you want me to read something for you, like a specific reading, just tell me what book and what section, and I'll do a reading for you since you joined as a member a little while ago during a stream. I'm not gonna want to be going very much longer, guys. Just to let you know, just simply because I'm tired today. I did a lot of stuff, including some baking. And if you're wondering, ooh, what sort of delicious treats were you baking? I was actually baking dog treats. So I was making dog treats for the dog, but not anything that I'm gonna eat. But he really likes them. But yeah, stuffed crust with garlic crust seasoning and bacon, jalapenos, and onions. That sounds amazing. I mean, you're like everything about you're like bacon, great. Jalapenos, even better. Onions, amazing. Yeah. So I'm just sort of like in some physical discomfort today. You want me to pick? Okay. I'm going to read you a little bit from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight then. How about that? Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Is that the dog on my profile picture? If you're referring to bean burritos with cheese, that sounds good. If you're referring to my profile on Discord, different dog. The dog that was Gibbs. He passed away, unfortunately, but his brother is still around. If you've ever been to my gaming streams, the icon that subscribers on Twitch have is Gunny, and also on the starting soon screen, you'll see him there. Okay, so hey Gray, let me read you a little bit of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, as translated by Tolkien. Let's see, where are we gonna, I think I would like to go, it's okay, don't worry about it. I think I would like to read, hmm. Okay. I'm going to read the part where it's towards the end of the poem where Gawain actually meets the Green Knight. A year hence from their original confrontation during the Christmas feast at King Arthur's table. Then clearly the knight there called out aloud, "Who is master in this place to meet me at tryst? For now 'tis good Gawain on ground that here walks. If any aught hath to ask, let him hasten to me, either now or else never his needs to further." "Stay," said one standing above the steep bar's head, "and thou shalt get in good time what to give thee I vowed." Still with that rasping and racket he rushed on a while, and went back to his wetting till he wished to descend. And then he climbed past a crag and came from a hole, hurtling out of a hid nook with a horrible weapon, a Danish axe newly dressed to the dint of a turn, with cruel cutting edge curved along the handle, filed on a whetstone and 4 feet in width. Actually, this isn't the part I was thinking of. This is earlier, but I'm going to continue. "'Twas no less, along its lace of luminous hue, and the great man in green still guised as before, his locks and long beard, his legs and his face, save that firm on his feet he fared on the ground, steadied the haft of the stones, and stalked beside it, when he walked to the water where he wade would not. He hopped over on his axe and haughtily strode, fierce and fell on a field where far all about lay snow. Sir Gawain the man met there, neither bent nor bowed he low. The other said, "Now, sirrah fair, I true at tryst thee know." "Gawain," said that green man, "may God keep thee. On my word, sir, I welcome thee with a will to my place." Oh, this is what I was thinking of. Okay. "And thou hast timed thy travels as trusty man should, and thou hast forgotten not the engagement agreed on between us. At this time gone a 12-month thou lookest thy allowance, and I should know this new year nimbly repay thee, and we are in this valley now verily on our own. There are no people to part us, we can play as we like. Have thy helm off thy head, and have thee here thy pay. Bandying me no more debate than I brought before thee, when thou didst sweep off my head with one swipe only. Nay," quoth Gawain, "by God that gave me my soul, I shall grudge thee not a grain of grief that follows, only restrain thee to one stroke, and still shall I stand, and oft as thou likest right here." Oh, what happened here? Did the stream go down for a moment? It looked like it kind of had like a moment there. Although it says I've been live for an hour and 47 minutes. I think it's on Wi-Fi, so some kind of hiccup. Yeah, I think there was a small little tiny hiccup. Let me continue here. Sorry about that. I mean, it's on my phone, so it's the best we could do. Then the great man in green gladly prepared him, gathered up his grim tool there Gawain to smite. With all the lust in his limbs aloft he heaved it, shaped as mighty a stroke as if he meant to destroy it. Had it driving come down as dour as he aimed it, under his dint would have died the most doughty man ever. But Gawain on that gear saw him, then glanced to one side, as down it came gliding on the green, there to end him. And he shrank a little on his shoulders at the sharp iron. With a jolt the other man jerked back the blade, and reproved them the prince, proudly him taunting. "That not Gawain," said the green man, "who is so good reported, who never flinched from any foes on fell or in dale, and now thou fleest in fear, or thou feelst a hurt? Of such cowardice that night I ne'er had accused, neither blenched nor I backed when thy blows, sir, thou aimed nor uttered any cavil in the court of King Arthur. My head flew to my feet, and yet I fled I never. But thou, ere thou hast any hurt, and thy heart quailest, and so the nobler knight to be named I deserve therefore. I blenched once," Gawain said, "and I will do so no more. But if on the floor now falls my head, I cannot it restore. But get busy, I beg, sir, and bring me to the point. Deal me my destiny, and do it out of hand, for I shall stand from thee a stroke, and stir not again, till thine axe hath hit me. Have here my word on't." Have it thee then, said the other, and heaved it aloft, and ratched him as wrathfully as if it were wild with rage. He made at him a mighty arm, a mighty aim, but the man he touched not, holding back hastily his hand ere hurt it might do. Gawain warily awaited it, and winced with no limb, but stood as still as a stone or the stump of a tree, that with 100 ravelled roots and rocks is embedded. This time merrily remarked then the man in the green, So now thou hast thy heart whole, a hit I must make. May the high order now keep thee that Arthur gave thee, and guard thy gullet at this go, if it can gain thee that. Angrily with ire then answered Sir Gawain, Why, lash away, thou lusty man? Too long dost thou threaten. 'Tis thy heart, methinks, in thee that now quaileth. In faith, said the fellow, oh, so fiercely thou speakest, I shall no longer linger, delaying thy errand right now. Then to strike he took his stance, and grimaced with lip and brow. He that of rescue saw no chance was little pleased, I trow. I think that's we'll stop that there. Okay, let's catch up on chat here. Yeah, I'm sorry if there was a small hiccup. It didn't seem to actually affect you guys here. Hey, Spielcub, how's it going? If I could take a weapon and have it as my own from the Legendarium, what weapon would I choose and why? Oh man, that's a. You know what I think would be a cool one to have? Gimli's axe. Maybe he left it in Middle Earth after he sailed to the west, figuring he wouldn't need it anymore. That would probably be it, right? I wouldn't want anything too crazy, right? You own Tolkien's translation? I mean, it's really great. Hey, actually, wait. Let's not stop you, Deborah. You left me a donation, didn't you? Thank you very much. And would you like me to do a reading for you? We're going to end stream soon, but I was just saying earlier that if you came by, I do owe you a reading. So, Deborah, if you'd like, you could choose the book and the part if you'd like me to. So I do owe you a reading. So absolutely. Just tell me what book and what section you would like me to read from. I just did one for Bonnie Bell, who joined as a member. We were reading a little bit of Tolkien's translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which I highly, highly recommend you get. Also, highly recommend watching the film version, which came out a few years ago. It's not based specifically on Tolkien's story, but it is really good. Really good movie. One of the best sort of King Arthur movies that I've seen, Even though it's just that one story, it's just Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It made a great, great sort of film. But yeah. But I'm looking to end soon. But since Deborah came by, I did want to see if I could do a reading for her. Let me just get a drink of water here. Oh, here's another nice mess you've gotten me into. There's Alice, 18 months as a member. I'll have to do a reading for you as well. Maybe something from Lost Tales. You like the bit where Gandalf... oh, you mean Unfinished Tales. Actually, yes, okay, Lost Tales is something different. You're talking about the Quest of Erebor. I read just a little tiny bit of that earlier, but I would like to do more of it. Where is Unfinished Tales? Oh, there it is. Ah, and Walter. Walter, you get a reading too. Okay. Oh, no, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. Yes, Walter, you get a reading too. All right, let's read a little bit of the Quest of Erebor. I think the second version is the better version. And then something for Alice and something for Walter. Guys, think about it. Don't say it until I ask, but think about what you want me to read. I did kind of want to read the part that you were talking about, where he said that let me put you down for a moment while I find it, where he said that, oh, it's a little different than what you might be used to hearing from Bilbo. I'm working on finding it. You know what? Let me just reread the little bit that I did before and sort of continue from there. "You make your stealth sound as difficult and hopeless as any open attack," said Balin. "Impossibly difficult." "Yes, it is difficult," I answered, "but not impossibly difficult, or I would not waste my time here." Let me do the voice. I'll do the Gandalf voice. "So I'm going to suggest an absurd solution to the problem. Take a hobbit with you. Smaug has probably never heard of hobbits, and he has certainly never smelt them." "What?" cried Gloin. "One of those simpletons down in the Shire. What use on earth or under it could he possibly be? Let him smell as he may, he would never dare to come within smelling distance of the nakedest dragon new from his shell." Now, I said, "that is quite unfair. You do not know much about the Shire folk, Gloin. I suppose you think them simple because they are generous and do not haggle, and think them timid because you never sell them any weapons. You are mistaken. Anyway, there is one that I have had my eye on as a companion for you, Thorin. He is neat-handed and clever, though shrewd and far from rash, and I think he has courage. Great courage, I guess, according to the way of his people. They are, you might say, brave at a pinch. You have to put these hobbits in a tight place before you find out what it is in them." "The test cannot be made," Thorin answered. "As far as I have observed, they do all they can to avoid tight places." "Quite true," I said. "They are very sensible people, but this hobbit is rather unusual. I think he could be persuaded to go into a tight place. I believe that in his heart he really desires to have, as he would put it, an adventure." "Not at my expense," said Thorin, rising and striding about angrily. "This is not advice, it is foolery. I fail to see how any hobbit, good or bad, could do that would repay me for a day's keep, even if he could be persuaded to start." "Fail to see? You would fail to hear it, more likely," I answered. "Hobbits move without effort more quietly than any dwarf in the world could imagine, though his life depended on it. They are, I suppose, the most soft-footed of all mortal kinds. You do not seem to have observed that, at any rate, Thorin Oakenshield, as you tramped through the Shire, making a noise, I must say, that the inhabitants could hear a mile away." "When I say that you would need stealth, I meant it professional stealth." "Professional stealth," said Balin, taking up my words rather differently than I would have meant them. "Do you mean a trained treasure hunter? Can they still be found?" I hesitated. This was a new turn, and I was not sure how to take it. "I think so," I said at last. "For a reward they will go, and where you dare not, or at any rate cannot, and get what you desire." Thorin's eyes glistened at the memories of lost treasures moved in his mind, but said, "A paid thief, you mean," he said scornfully. "That might be considered if the reward was not too high. But what has all this to do with one of those villagers? They drink out of clay, and they cannot tell a gem from a bead of glass." "I wish you would not speak so confidently without knowledge," I said sharply. "These villagers lived in the Shire some 1,400 years, and they have learned many things in that time. They have had dealings with the elves and with the dwarves 1,000 years before Smaug came to Erebor. None of them are wealthy as your forefathers reckoned it, but you would find some of the dwellings have fairer things in them than you can boast here, Thorin. The hobbit that I have in mind has ornaments of gold, and eats with silver tools, and drinks wine out of shapely crystal." "Ah, I see your drift at last," said Balin. "He is a thief, then. That is why you recommended him." At that I lost my temper and my caution. This dwarfish conceit that no one can have or make anything of value save themselves, and that all fine things in other hands must have been got if not stolen from the dwarves at some time, was more than I can stand in the moment. "A thief," I said, laughing. "Why, yes, a professional thief, of course. How else would a hobbit come by a silver spoon? I will put the thief's mark on his door, and then you will find it." Then, being angry, I got up, and I said with a warmth that surprised myself, "You must look for that door, Thorin Oakenshield. I am serious." And suddenly I felt that I was indeed a hot earnest. This queer notion of mine was not a joke. It was right. It was desperately important that it should be carried out. The dwarves must bend their stiff necks. Okay. Yeah, we have. But that's okay, Coyote. Don't worry about it. Okay. Thorin's final words from The Hobbit. Oh, yes, that's very sad. We'll go with that. Walter, think about what you want me to read for you, and then I think we'll end stream after that. Let me grab The Hobbit for you guys. Let's see. That's not The Hobbit. Here we are. Let me get to that page here. I'm looking for it. Here we are, the return journey. All right, this is for Alice. Here we go. When Bilbo came to himself, he was literally by himself. He was lying in the flat stones of Ravenhill, and no one was near. A cloudless day, but cold, was broad above him. He was shaking, and his child chilled as stone, but his head burned with fire. Now I wonder what has happened, he said to himself. At any rate, I am not yet one of the fallen heroes, but I suppose there is still time enough for that. He sat up painfully. Looking to the valley, he could see no living goblins. After a while, as his head cleared a little, he thought he could see elves moving in the rocks below. He rubbed his eyes. Surely there was a camp still in the plain some distance off, and there was a coming and going about the gate. Dwarves seemed to be busy removing the wall. But all was deadly still. There was no call and no echo of a song. Sorrow seemed to be in the air. Victory after all, I suppose, he said, feeling his aching head. Well, it seems a very gloomy business. Suddenly he was aware of a man climbing up and coming towards there. Hello there, he called in a shaky voice. Hello there, what news? What voice is it that speaks among the stones? Said the man, halting and peering about him from far beyond where Bilbo sat. Then Bilbo remembered his ring. Well, I'm blessed, said he. This invisibility has its drawbacks after all. Otherwise, I suppose I might have spent a warm and comfortable night in bed. It's me, Bilbo Baggin, companion of Thorin, he cried, hurriedly taking off the ring. It is well that I have found you, said the man, striding forward. You are needed, and we have looked for you long. You would have been numbered among the dead, who were many, if Gandalf the Wizard had not said that your voice was last heard in this place. I have been sent here to look here for the last time. Are you much hurt? A nasty knock on the head, I think, said Bilbo. But I have a helm and a hard skull. All the same, I feel sick, and my legs are like straws. I will carry you down into the camp in the valley, said the man, who picked him lightly up. The man was swift and sure-footed. It was not long before Bilbo was sat down before a tent in Dale, and there stood Gandalf with his arm in a sling. Even though the wizard had not escaped without a wound, and there were few unharmed in all the host. When Gandalf saw Bilbo, he was delighted. Baggins, he exclaimed. Well, I never. Alive after all, I am glad. I began to wonder if even your luck would see you through. A terrible business, but it nearly was disastrous. But other news can wait. Come, he said more gravely. You were called for. And leading the hobbit, he took him within the tent. Hail, Thorin, he said as he entered. I have brought him. There indeed lay Thorin Oakenshield, wounded with many wounds, and his rent armor and notched axe were cast upon the floor. He looked up at as Bilbo came beside him. Farewell, good thief, he said. I go now to the halls of waiting to sit beside my fathers, until the world is renewed. Since I leave now all gold and silver, and go where it is of little worth, I wish to part in friendship from you, and I would take back my words and deeds at the gate. Bilbo knelt on one knee, filled with sorrow. Farewell, King under the mountain, he said. This is a bitter adventure if it must end so, and not a mountain of gold can amend it. Yet I am glad that I have shared in your perils. That has been more than any Baggins deserves. No, said Thorin. There is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Some courage and some wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell. That actually works really well with the previous part, huh? With the previous reading, because Deborah asked me to read, a little bit of Thorin from Unfinished Tales, and then we hear, the final words of Thorin and how very, very different his take on Bilbo is there, Yeah. Sad, bittersweet, I think is the right word for it, because, it's, yeah, it's sort of like what Bilbo said, he said he's sorry that Thorin died, but, he was just so happy that Thorin came to himself at the end, Um, At some point, you'd like to understand the difference between the Lost Tales and the Silmarillion. They're just different drafts of the same story. The Silmarillion is much less detailed, um, and it's more of a chronicle than a story. Whereas the Book of Lost Tales is really like an early version of it, where it's very, very detailed. But there's a lot of things that were early ideas, early characters and such. But yeah, that section there always gets me. It's very, very emotional. And what Thorin says there at the end, if we all just, thought less of money and material wealth and what we could get from others, and more of what we could give to others, song and food and good conversation and, just being cheerful and lifting each other's up. If that was true, if the world was really like that, if we were all more like Bilbo and less like Thorin, the world would be great, you know? Okay, so I believe Walter wanted something also from The Hobbit. Let me scroll up a bit here. Queer Lodgings, Chapter 7, yes. Okay. All right. I think I can do that for you. Well, I know I could do it for you, but I just, I think we want to just, you want the song more or do you want the story part more? I think you want the song, right? The first part that you mentioned is very long, and I would like to end soon, especially since I do kind of have to go to the bathroom here. You think the author was speaking there with Thorin's voice? Absolutely. That's definitely the thoughts of the author in there. Absolutely. Okay, let's start from here. There they had a supper or a dinner such as they had not had since they left the last homely house in the west and said goodbye to Elrond. The light of the torches and the fire flickered about them, and on the table were two tall red beeswax candles. All the time that they ate, Beorn in his deep rolling voice told tales of the wild lands in this side of the mountains, and especially of the dark and dangerous wood that lay outstretched far to the north and south, a day's ride before them, barring their way to the east, a terrible forest of Mirkwood. The dwarves listened and shook their beards, for they knew that they must soon venture into that forest, and that after the mountains it was the worst of the perils they had to pass before they came to the dragon's stronghold. When dinner was over, they began to tell tales of their own, but Beorn seemed to be growing drowsy and paid little heed to them. They spoke most of gold and silver and jewels and the making of things by smithcraft, and Beorn did not appear to care for such things. There were no things of gold or silver in his hall, and few save the knives were made of metal at all. They sat long at the table with their wooden drinking bowls filled with mead. The dark night came on outside. The fires in the middle of the hall were built with fresh logs, and the torches were put out, and still they sat in the light of the dancing flames, with the pillars of the house standing tall behind them, and dark at the top like trees of the forest. Whether it was magic or not, it seemed to Bilbo that he heard a sound like wind in the branches stirring in the rafters, and the hoot of owls. Soon he began to nod with sleep, and the voices seemed to grow far away, until he woke with a start. The great door had creaked and slammed. Beorn had gone. The dwarves were sitting cross-legged on the floor round the fire, and presently they began to sing. Some of the verses were like this, but there were many more, and their singing went on for a long while. The wind was on the withered heath, but in the forest stirred no leaf. There shadows lay by night and day, and dark things silent crept beneath. Turning the page here. Mead is great. I do like mead. The wind came down from mountains cold, and like a tide it roared and rolled. Like branches groaned, the forest moaned, and leaves were laid upon the mould. The wind went on from west to east, all movement in the forest ceased, but shrill and harsh across the marsh its whistling voices were released. The grasses hissed, their tassels bent, the reeds were rattling, on it went, o'er shaking pool under havens cold, where racing clouds were torn and rent. It passed the lonely mountain bare, and swept above the dragon's lair, there black and dark, and lay bold as stark, and flying smoke was in the air. It left the world and took its flight, over the wide seas of the night. The moon set sail upon the gale, and stars were fanned to leaping height. Oh, there you have it. You know, it's interesting. There's that apocryphal story of somebody being at a Tolkien Society meeting and hearing a bunch of Tolkien scholars argue for 6 hours about whether or not bees existed in Middle Earth, and there's so many references to bees. I don't know how anybody could think that. I mean, there's the beeswax candles and honey and mead and just mention that Bjorn kept bees and I mean people will say, oh, that's the Hobbit, that doesn't count. Well, in the Lord of the Rings, there's so many mentions of mead, and Bilbo wrote a poem called Errantry that included something called Dumbledores, which is just an old English word that means bees, bumblebees specifically. Um, Meat is delicious. I should get me some. There's this one meat company that's been very highly marketed towards me that I might order a bottle. It's very affordable actually, and got good reviews. So you know, you're looking at it right now. Oh, and I'm doing my job right now. So anyway, guys, maybe for Christmas, oh, a little Christmas gift for myself. Okay, maybe. I gotta worry about buying gifts for everybody else before I buy a gift for myself, though. But anyway, guys, we're going to end stream here. I thank you for everybody that came by and everybody that's donated on here, on through PayPal, through GoFundMe. I'm gonna have a new computer soon, I think. I mean, it's still gonna take a while because, like I said, the money has to clear. I have to send it to the person that's gonna build the computer. They have to actually do it and send it to me, and I have to set it up and everything. But I'm really hoping to be back in the saddle of doing everything again, and that includes streams. It includes writing and answering your questions and making videos and everything. I haven't been obviously. Don't end. You just joined. Oh, I'm sorry. It's been 2 hours and my legs are hurting a lot today. But I will be streaming again. Don't worry. Yeah, there's my Discord, so we could chat there if you want. But I need to get back in the writing. I need to start writing again. Otherwise, everything else falls apart because that's where it all comes from is writing. Um, but yeah, I'm gonna thank you guys, for everything. Really, it's been really great. It's been hard not being able to, really work here. Doing it from my phone is not ideal. It's not comfortable. I don't have my green screen. I don't have, it's not Middle Earth behind me. It's just a wall. you know. I mean, up there you can see there's Frodo's up there. I don't know, you can't really see him there, but Frodo's up there. But anyway, guys, I gotta head out. I will see you guys soon. If you're not on the Discord, there's a Discord link right there that William Stone just put in the chat there. And you guys can send me questions that I will, if you want them to be in a video, send them either on Quora or on the community tab on my channel. You have to do it through a mobile device. There's a little button on my channel that says join the community, and you can post questions there. They'll be in a video when I get to do videos again, which hopefully won't be too long. Yeah. Hey, yeah, like I said, I've been trying to keep up the streaming schedule, but it's difficult to do everything from just a phone. So thank you, Matthew Smith there. All right, guys. So we're gonna end right here. Tomorrow I'll probably stream in the afternoon. It'll probably be a gaming stream, but I'll let you know. I'll put it out on Discord. It'll probably be on Twitch, but let's see. How do I gotta figure out how to end this. I did it once. Oh, here we go. Okay. All right. See you guys next time.